Howdy friends, and welcome to my newest video. So, this is a pretty cute dress, right? I made it for Halloween last year and I have a video about it, but it's missing a little bit of something. Firstly, it wants to stick to my tights, which, yes, could be solved with just a slip, but the hemline is also just a little bit sad. Maybe something like these flared petticoats with the ruffle at the hem. There we go. Now we have some volume and some life in this skirt. Or perhaps a petticoat like these flounced ones. Now we're really getting into some Dior new look territory. There's some volume in there, maybe even too much volume for a flared skirt like this. For anyone into history bounding, vintage fashion in general, or even just wearing very full skirts, I always recommend two things: a petticoat and a slip. The shape of your petticoat will depend on the shape of your skirt, and in an effort not to destroy my antique petticoat, and given that my current favorite petticoat is a little too short, I thought I would take you through making a couple different petticoat styles. The first style I made is a petticoat with 6 flared pieces and a ruffle towards the hem, worn with the flared skirts that don't have much volume at the waist, such as the Edwardian walking skirt and the Keystone Guide. For the flared pieces, you'll want your waist measurement divided by 5 for the top of your panels. And then for the bottom, you want the flare to be at least twice as wide as the top, so that you have room, number 1 for walking and number 2 just for the flare to go over your hips. And then connect those two lines. We're using 5 as our measurement so that we can add a little bit of gathering at the center back, and also just in case your hip to waist ratio means that it's not quite enough. For the length of those flared petticoat pieces, I'd recommend that you shoot for around an inch shorter than most of your skirts, and that you also subtract from that the length of your ruffle. I wanted my finished petticoats to be 24 and 33 inches. So I had an 18-inch flared panel and a 27-inch flared panel with my 5.5-inch ruffle accounted for. Once you've added your seam allowance and gotten everything drafted, you can cut things out. You'll notice that I'm cutting everything out with pinking shears here. That's because this is a lightweight quilting cotton, so it doesn't fray very much. My preferred method is usually French seams, but those are hard to do on flounces and ruffles, and harder still to iron if I were to starch them. So I pinked them, and at some point further down the line I can add on lace or bias tape to those unfinished edges, including the gap at the center back. For the bottom ruffle, I knew I wanted it to be about 5.5, 6 inches wide. So I cut mine to be 7 inches wide and cut out so I had approximately enough to make each ruffle twice the finished width of the flared panels so that they would sit nicely. I find that 2 inches tends to look the best when it comes to ruffles and flounces such as this. Style number 2 of petticoat here is a flounced petticoat attached to an elasticized waist. These are a lot easier to put on and they're a ton of fun to wear, I must say. I wanted these petticoats to be approximately 24 and 33 inches as well. So I divided each of those measurements by 2 without adding any seam allowance or anything because that is going to be taken up with the waistband. And the cotton I used for this project was 45 inches wide, just wide enough that I could scoop it over my hips without needing another closure method other than the elastic. And I wanted each of my ruffles to be twice the width of the previous one. So I cut 2 of each width, the 12 and the 16.5 for the top ruffle, or flounce, and 4 of those for the bottom for each petticoat. I also cut out 4 7-inch wide strips that you saw earlier for the flared petticoat, and 2 3-inch wide strips, one for each of the petticoats that will serve as a home for the elastic. I also cut out a couple of 2-inch wide strips, just little baby ones, to use as the ties for the flared petticoats because those will not have an elasticized waistband. To prepare the strings for the flared petticoats that will finish the top, I ironed them in half. You could also use bias tape for this, I just didn't want to, so I folded it in half and then in half again so that I had 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape. Or, well, not quite bias tape, but 1/2 inch wide double fold tape in order to make into the tieable waistband on those. Then I prepared the waistband on the flounced petticoats, and I took that 3-inch strip and ironed about half an inch in and then another ½ inch in to make a narrow channel to thread the elastic band through. I sorted all my ruffles by width and then started pinning them together. It's easier to pin them the full length and then put them through the sewing machine than to gather each one individually and then try and sew them all together. It just makes it a lot easier when you're gathering, so that's what I would recommend. So I pinned 2 pieces together for the top ruffle and 4 of them together for the bottom ruffle so that I could get all of them done at the same time. And while I was sewing everything together, I also put together my flared pieces so that I could run those through my machine as well. And I'm just using plain seams for this because, as I said, I pinked my fabric edges and I didn't want anything to be too complicated. I was kind of doing this in a creative rush of excitement without much thought for exactly how nicely I was finishing things. You can see me leaving an opening at the center back seam. I'm leaving those 8 inches on each flared petticoat open at the center back so that it serves as an opening to get the garment on and off later. You could make this into a zippered seam or make a little strip as a modesty panel to cover up the gap between, but for now I've just left it open and sewed the seam allowances down. I sewed all of the flared panels with an ordinary straight stitch of an ordinary length for this particular weight of fabric with no other frills. Once all of that was done, I was able to turn my stitch length up to the longest setting possible and zoom the back 2 panels on the flared petticoats through my machine, along with the entire lengths of the ruffles that have now been sewn together and pressed with the seam allowance open, all zoomed very, very quickly through my sewing machine twice in order to give me some thread to gather them. I also sewed up the channels for the elastic in the waistbands at this point, although I'm not sure why I didn't do it earlier. It would have saved me a little bit of trouble just setting the dial back. To gather fabric, take one of the 2 threads, either the top thread or the bottom thread. It doesn't really matter which, as long as they match. If there's more than one thread line, I suppose, and then gently tug the fabric towards the middle of the fabric to cause the fabric to bunch up. Once you've gathered it enough, you can fuss until it matches the length of what you're gathering, and arrange the gathers neatly so that they're evenly spread out along the width of the fabric. And because of how many ruffles and how many flounces I had with this particular project, it took me approximately 84 years to do all of the gathering for this. Once my truly infinite ruffling and gathering were done, I sewed the entirety of the ties on the skirt waistband to itself. Despite it being gathered down to my exact waist measurement, I used the whole of the fabric width in order to create these ties so that I would have space to actually tie the waistband and not have it be way too short. At this point, I also inserted the elastic into the channels on the flounced petticoats. Cut the elastic just a couple inches smaller than your waist so that you don't have to worry about it ending up too large if, say, your channel is slightly too small, because that can affect it. And I used a safety pin in the elastic to draw it through. After that, I did up the back seam on the flounced petticoats, and I was careful to catch that elastic in the back seam so that it won't come loose from the actual seam and end up with a waistband that is too large. And then the final step was to hem all of these petticoats, which I did everything with a 1/2 inch double rolled hem. So I measured 1 inch up, folded the fabric up to that line, and then did it again in order to make my fabric roll up and neatly enclose the raw edge at the bottom. This is a pretty standard way of doing hems, and I really like the way it looks. In the end, I have 4 beautiful petticoats now, and you hopefully have the tools to create at least one. I'm excited to get started on some history bounding and vintage style skirts to fill these babies out, though. I do want the longer flared petticoats flounce to be a little bit longer. I might get around to that eventually. Like this video if you liked this video, and hit that subscribe button down below if you want to see those new projects that I'll be working on, and possibly that notification bell if you wish to be notified, because apparently the subscribe button does not do that anymore. You can also hit up my Discord to show off the things that you make, not just sewing stuff. We have all kinds of artsy-fartsy stuff, like both digital and traditional art, prop making. We've got somebody who does 3D modeling. It's a great time. Come get art praise. And consider donating to me on Ko-fi. Coffee, however you pronounce that, if you want me to do more fancy stuff.